Parking in front of a school for a business meeting, a millionaire noticed a 6-year-old girl crying alone by the gate. Moved by an inexplicable compassion, he approached her and gently asked what had happened. With a trembling voice full of fear, she whispered, "Uncle, I'm afraid to go back home." At first, he thought it was just childish imagination, but when she revealed in disturbing detail what her stepfather had done to her and her mother the night before, his entire world collapsed. Arthur Monroe's world was built on the silence of numbers and the aroma of imported coffee that hung in his office on the top floor of the tallest building in the city. From that panoramic window, he didn't see people, but a chessboard where he moved his businesses, his investments, and his vast net worth with the precision of a grandmaster. On that frigid winter morning, New York City was a grey blur under a leaden sky. But in his mind, the colorful charts of the stock market danced, showing the steady growth of his fortune. Each new digit in his bank balance was another layer of protection against the kind of disorder that emotions brought. A chaos he had eliminated from his life a decade ago. At 35, Arthur was the architect of his own empire, a man who confused stock value with the value of a life and who measured generosity in press releases. His most recent donation to a children's home, and for example, had already generated a positive uptick in his brand's perception, an excellent return on investment. His concentration was broken by the soft buzz of the intercom. "Mr. Monroe," said the velvety voice of Beatrice, his executive assistant. "Pardon the interruption, but there's a visitor, a rather insistent one." Arthur frowned, his eyes still fixed on the screen displaying quotes in dollars and euros. "I have no scheduled meetings, Beatrice. Tell them I'm busy." There was a hesitant pause. "I already have, sir." But she refuses to leave. She's a very small visitor. Curiosity, an emotion Arthur rarely allowed himself, pricked at his armored mind. A child, perhaps a partner's daughter, lost in the building. "Send her in. I have 2 minutes, he said, more out of boredom than anything else, straightening his silk tie as if preparing to receive a foreign dignitary. The solid oak door swung open, and through it entered the most incongruous figure that Sanctuary of Capital had ever witnessed. A girl of perhaps 6, with long brown braids and eyes of the same color. So large and serious they seemed to carry the weight of the world. She wore a simple, slightly faded cotton dress and worn shoes, but they were immaculately clean. In her small hands, she clutched with surprising force a plump, pink piggy bank, which seemed to vibrate with the jingle of coins. She walked timidly to the imposing mahogany desk, the sound of her steps muffled by the Persian rug. There, under the calculating gaze of the multimillionaire, she stretched out her arms and placed the piggy bank on the polished surface with a dull thud. Arthur raised an eyebrow, amusement beginning to dance in his eyes. "And what might this be?" he asked, his voice softer than he'd intended. The girl looked up at him, unwavering. "It's all my money," she said, her voice clear and firm. "I want to hire you." A laugh escaped Arthur's lips, a rare, rusty sound. "Hire me? For what, little one?" The seriousness on the child's face did not diminish. On the contrary, it intensified. "I want you to marry my mom." Arthur's laugh died in his throat, replaced by a genuine bewilderment. He looked at the pink piggy bank, then at the girl's determined face. The situation was so absurd it felt like a fever dream. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "Listen, honey, I don't think you understand. Things don't work that way." But the girl interrupted him, her voice filled with an unshakable conviction. "My mom said the great love of her life was the richest man in the city. She always talks about him when she thinks I'm asleep. It makes her sad. And I know you're the richest man. Your name is in the paper. If you marry her, she'll be happy again." Arthur felt a pang of something that might have been pity, a childish fantasy born from a mother's melancholy words. To end the bizarre conversation, he decided to play along. "I see. That's quite a proposal. And what's the name of this mother of yours, who has such expensive taste?" The girl took a deep breath, as if the name were sacred. "Her name is Elena." Eleanor. The name fell like a stone into the silent well of Arthur's memory, and the shockwaves rippled through every fiber of his being. The air grew thick, heavy, and the luxurious office, with its glass walls and view of the empire he had built, suddenly felt like a cage. The monitors displaying the constant flow of his capital, the rise and fall of stocks that dictated his mood, became an insignificant blur. His entire net worth, his vast fortune accumulated in dollars, gold, and crypto, seemed to evaporate before that name. That small, serious face staring at him from across the desk. Time stopped. For an instant, he was no longer Arthur Monroe, the ruthless billionaire, but just Art, the college kid with more dreams than dollars, holding the hand of a girl named Eleanor under the campus trees, promising a future he himself would destroy. The memory came with the force of an avalanche. He saw her clearly, her smile, the way her hair fell across her face when she laughed, the sparkle in her eyes when she talked about her plans to become a teacher. They shared cheap takeout and million-dollar dreams. She believed in him, in his ambition, but she never imagined that same ambition would exclude her from his life. He remembered the night it all ended, the internship offer overseas, the golden opportunity to start building his business. "It's just for a little while, Elena," he had lied, as much to himself as to her. "When I get back, we'll have everything." But he never came back. Success consumed him. Every profit, every dividend was another brick in the wall he built between his present and his past. He left her behind, answering her letters and calls less and less, until silence became the final answer. He chose wealth over love. "Sir?" The girl's voice brought him back to the cold reality of his office. He blinked, his heart hammering against his ribs. The child was still there, watching him with worried curiosity. He had to say something, do something. His mind, usually so sharp at closing deals, was paralyzed. He pressed the intercom button, his hand trembling slightly. "Beatrice, please come to my office." His assistant entered seconds later, her professional gaze faltering at the unusual scene. "Beatrice, please take this young lady to the break room. Offer her some juice, cookies, whatever she wants, and find out how she got up here." He spoke without taking his eyes off the girl, who looked at him with a doubtful expression, as if fearing her business proposal had been rejected. "I'll be right back," he told her, his voice hoarse. When the door closed, leaving him alone again, Arthur collapsed into his leather chair. The pink piggy bank seemed to mock him, a monument to his colossal failure. He picked up the phone, not to call his brokers or partners, but a number memorized for discreet emergencies. "Marcus, it's Arthur. I need you to find someone for me, now." He gave Elena's full name, his voice tense. "I need everything, where she lives, what she does, everything. It's urgent." On the other end of the line, the private investigator, accustomed to digging up dirt on competitors and running background checks, sensed the gravity in his client's voice. "Consider it done, Mr. Monroe." Arthur hung up and began to pace, a caged beast in his own ivory tower. Every minute of waiting was torture. What had happened to Elena all these years? Why was her daughter here, offering her life savings to buy her mother a husband? Guilt, a feeling he thought he had buried under layers of success, ate at him from the inside. The phone rang shrill, cutting through the silence. It was Marcus. Arthur answered on the first ring, his heart in his throat. "Did you find her?" "Yes, sir, the P," I said, his voice strangely restrained. "But it's not straightforward. She's not at home." A chill ran down Arthur's spine. "Where is she, Marcus?" There was a pause, and when the man spoke again, each word was a blow. "She's in the hospital, the intensive care unit at Metropolitan General. Sir, from what I gather, her situation is extremely critical." The detective's words echoed in Arthur's mind, like the death knell of a world he had tried to forget. ICU, public hospital, critical. Each term was a knife tearing through the armor of indifference he had spent a decade forging. The image of Elena, vibrant and full of life, was violently replaced by a terrifying vision of tubes, monitors, and the sterile chill of an intensive care unit. He hung up the phone without saying goodbye, his hand falling limply to his side. The air in his office felt thin, hard to breathe. He walked to the window, but the city below, with its ceaseless flow of life and commerce, offered no comfort. For the first time in years, his vast net worth seemed useless, a pile of colorful paper with no real value. What good was an empire if the only person who had ever loved him for who he was, not what he had, was fighting for her life in a hospital he'd never even glanced at? The guilt hit him with full force, a nauseating wave of remorse. He had abandoned her. He had traded her for numbers on a screen, for profits and interest that fed his ego but left his soul starving. While he was accumulating assets, she had been facing something terrible, alone. The little girl, now sipping juice in his break room, was living proof of the time he'd lost, of a life that had gone on without him, a life that he now feared might be coming to an end. The thought that her daughter wasn't his shot through him for a moment, a complex mix of relief and an inexplicable pang of loss. But that question seemed trivial in the face of the situation's urgency. The child's mother needed help, and he was the only one who knew, the only one who, ironically, had the resources to intervene. The calculated generosity he had always practiced now seemed like a sick joke. This wasn't about image or return on investment. This was about Elena. He acted on instinct, his business mind taking over to mask the emotional storm. He called the director of one of the most expensive and renowned hospitals in the country, a man who had benefited from his strategic donations in the past. "Dr. Evans, I need a favor, a big one." In minutes, he had articulated a plan, an immediate transfer, the best specialists, the most equipped suite. Money opened doors, and Arthur was about to kick them down. Next, he called the investigator again. "Marcus, I want you to go to the public hospital, find out the exact diagnosis, the name of the attending physician. I want all the information, but be discreet. No one can know I'm involved. No one." Discretion was crucial. He didn't want Elena, if and when she recovered, to think this was an act of pity or an attempt to clear his guilty conscience. For now, he would be an anonymous benefactor. When Beatrice returned to his office, she found a transformed man. The cold calm had been replaced by a feverish energy. "The girl, what's her name?" he asked abruptly. "Lucy, sir. Her name is Lucy." Lucy, a name meaning light. How ironic for a child living in the shadow of a tragedy. Beatrice, arrange for a car. Take Lucy home safely. Get the address. But don't ask questions. Tell her her proposal is under review. It was the best excuse he could invent. After they left, the silence of the office became oppressive again. He couldn't work, couldn't focus on his multi-million-dollar deals. The only thing that mattered was the report he was waiting for from Marcus. The wait was the longest of his life. When the phone finally rang, he snatched it up. Marcus's voice was somber. "I got the information, Mr. Monroe. The diagnosis is a rare and aggressive autoimmune disease. The treatment is experimental, extremely expensive, and not available through the public health system. They're just keeping her stable." Arthur closed his eyes, the reality crushing him. "And the girl?" he managed to ask. "Apparently, a neighbor brought her in. The mother collapsed suddenly 2 days ago. The girl stayed with this woman, but this morning she just disappeared. The neighbor didn't know she'd come here." The desperation of that child, setting out alone across the city to try and save her mother with a piggy bank, broke something inside Arthur. Without a second thought, he grabbed his coat. "Send me the hospital's address. I'm going there now. Metropolitan General Hospital. was a world apart from Arthur's sterile, luxurious one. The smell of antiseptic mixed with the subtle odor of suffering hung in the air, and the once white corridors were now a yellowish hue from time and heavy use. People with tired, worried eyes huddled in plastic chairs, their faces a mosaic of hope and despair. For a man accustomed to entering places through the front door, announced and revered, the need for anonymity was unsettling. He wore a baseball cap and sunglasses, a ridiculous camouflage that made him feel like a fugitive. His heart pounded, a mixture of fear, guilt, and an anxiety he hadn't felt since the days he'd risked all his seed capital on a dubious investment. But that risk had been purely financial. Now, what was at stake was Elena's life and his own sanity. Following Marcus's discreet instructions, he avoided the main entrance and found a side door leading to a quieter wing. The ICU was on the 3rd floor. Each step on the concrete stairs felt like it weighed a ton. He felt like an intruder, a ghost from a past that had no right to haunt this sacred place of struggle. Outside the unit's glass doors, he stopped. A sign warned, "Restricted access." Through the glass, he could see the rhythmic movement of nurses and doctors, figures in blue scrubs moving with professional calm amidst a tangle of technology and human fragility. He saw beds separated by curtains, each a small world of silent battle. His eyes searched for her, dreading what he would find. And then he saw her. She was in a bed in the corner, partially obscured by a monitor that blinked with green and red lights. Even from a distance, he recognized her, but it was a fragile, ethereal version of the Elena who lived in his memories. Her hair, which he remembered as full and lustrous, was dull and splayed across the pillow. Her face, once rosy and expressive, was pale and swollen. A thin tube ran into her nose, and several wires connected her still body to the machine that beeped beside her, a cruel metronome marking the precarious rhythm of her existence. She seemed to be asleep, or sedated, oblivious to the world and to the presence of the man who had shattered her heart. The sight broke him. The armor of self-control of Arthur Monroe, the unshakable billionaire, shattered into a million pieces. A sharp, raw, overwhelming pain pierced his chest. It was the pain of remorse, of loss, of what if. He leaned against the cold corridor wall, the air leaving his lungs. This was all his fault. If he hadn't abandoned her, if he had been by her side, maybe things would be different. Maybe she would have gotten an earlier diagnosis, better treatment. Maybe the stress of the precarious life he imagined she must have led hadn't aggravated her condition. He was the richest man in the city, with a net worth that could fund research and build hospitals, yet he had allowed the woman he loved to end up here, dependent on the charity of an overburdened healthcare system. The irony was crushing. He, who controlled the cash flow of conglomerates, had no control over the life slipping away just a few feet from him. A tired-looking doctor walked past. Arthur stopped him, his voice barely a whisper. "The patient in bed 3, Elena. What's the prognosis?" The doctor looked at him, surprised by the direct question from a stranger. "Are you family?" Arthur hesitated. "I'm an old friend." The doctor sighed, a sound heavy with exhaustion. "Her condition is critical. We're doing everything we can to keep her stable, but the disease is progressing quickly. The treatment she needs, it costs hundreds of thousands of dollars, and even then, there are no guarantees." Those words, which to anyone else would have been a death sentence, were a call to action for Arthur. Despair gave way to a cold determination. He had the money. The cost was not an obstacle. The real challenge would be something else entirely. How could he save her without revealing his role in it all? How could he repair a decade-old mistake without her hating him for it? He walked back to his car, his mind working a mile a minute. The plan to transfer her to a private hospital was in motion. He would cover all the costs, anonymously, through a shell foundation. It was the least he could do. But as he drove away from that place of pain, a new question began to haunt him, one that little Lucy's presence had planted in his mind. The girl wasn't his daughter, Marcus had confirmed, so who was her father? And where was he while the mother of his child was fighting for her life? The search for Eleanor was over, but a new, far more complex mystery was just beginning. The following days blurred into a flurry of clandestine logistics and mounting anxiety for Arthur. He operated from the shadows, moving his immense capital like a secret general in a war for Elena's life, through a newly created foundation, with lawyers and intermediaries ensuring his anonymity. He orchestrated her transfer from the public hospital to the most advanced suite at Mount Sinai Hospital, a fortress of cutting-edge medicine he himself had helped fund in the past. Every detail was meticulously planned: the private, state-of-the-art ambulance, the elite medical team awaiting her, the room that looked more like a luxury apartment overlooking a tranquil garden. He paid for everything, the astronomical figures debited from his accounts without him even blinking. Money, once a means to accumulate power and status, now had a single, desperate purpose: to buy Elena time. Meanwhile, he tasked Marcus with investigating the whereabouts of Lucy's father. The information came quickly, and it was as bleak as he'd feared. The man, a musician with more dreams than responsibilities, had charmed Eleanor a few years after her split with Arthur. The relationship blossomed, and Lucy was born. A brief period of happiness. However, when Elena received the diagnosis of the rare disease and the first debilitating signs began to show, the pressure became unbearable for him. Medical bills piled up. The future grew uncertain. He vanished. He simply packed a bag one day and left, leaving behind a sick woman and a small child with a vague note promising to return when he'd made it big. He had abandoned his family, leaving Elena to fight the disease and poverty alone. The anger Arthur felt was visceral, a cold fire burning in his chest. He hated the man for his cowardice, but a part of him, the honest, aching part, recognized the echo of his own abandonment. He had run away too. The difference was that he had run toward wealth, while the other had run from responsibility. But the result for Elena was the same: solitude in her moment of greatest need. This revelation only solidified his resolve. He couldn't fix the past, but he had the power to rewrite her and Lucy's future. He instructed Beatrice to take care of the girl. A nanny was hired, the elderly neighbor was generously compensated for her help, and Lucy was temporarily set up in a comfortable apartment near the new hospital, with the best of everything. The girl, confused but resilient, accepted the change, believing it was all part of the business plan to help her mum. Arthur visited the hospital every night, always after visiting hours, using his influence to gain unrestricted access. He would stand outside the glass-walled room, watching Elena sleep under sedation. Seeing her surrounded by the best medical technology his money could buy brought him minimal relief. The doctors were optimistic. With the new experimental treatment, her chances had significantly improved, but the guilt still haunted him. He was an anonymous benefactor, a ghost paying the bills. The emotional distance was torture. He wanted to go into that room, hold her hand, and beg for forgiveness, but he couldn't. The fear of her reaction, of her hatred, paralyzed him. The turning point came on a Tuesday night. The doctors decided to reduce her sedation to assess her neurological response. Arthur was in his usual spot, on the other side of the glass, when he saw her eyelids flutter. His heart leaped. Slowly, painfully, Elena opened her eyes. Her gaze was confused, wandering around the unfamiliar room, the expensive equipment. And then her eyes found his. For an instant, there was only recognition, surprise. But then the fog of confusion cleared, replaced by a storm of emotions he knew all too well: pain, hurt, and a cold fury that shot through the glass and hit him like a fist. Her lips moved, forming a single word he couldn't hear, but understood perfectly. You. With an effort that seemed to consume all her energy, she pressed the nurse's call button. When the professional entered, Eleanor pointed a trembling finger in Arthur's direction. Her eyes never left his, burning him with a decade of repressed pain. The nurse looked at Arthur, confused, then back at her patient. Elena spoke, her voice weak and hoarse, but laced with an unshakable force. Get him out. I don't want to see him ever again." Her request, an order fired from her sickbed, was the most brutal rejection Arthur had ever faced. He, the man who bought everyone and everything, had just been thrown out by the one person whose acceptance he now craved more than his entire net worth. Eleanor's command, delivered with the faint voice of someone struggling to breathe, had the impact of a vault door slamming shut in his face. Arthur stepped back instinctively, as if from a physical blow. The nurse, caught in the middle of the silent, intense drama, looked at him with an expression that mixed professionalism with a hint of pity. "Sir, I think it's best if you leave," she said, her voice gentle but firm. He didn't argue, he just nodded, feeling Elena's glare burning into his back as he walked away down the polished corridor, each footstep an echo of his defeat. The man who moved markets with a phone call, who swayed boards with a gesture, was powerless against the will of a woman tethered to a hospital bed. His money could buy the best treatment, the most luxurious room, but it couldn't erase 10 years of silence and abandonment. In the days that followed, the hospital became an impenetrable fortress. Elena's instructions were clear and absolute. Arthur Monroe was forbidden to visit. He tried to use his influence, speaking to the hospital director, but Dr. Evans was adamant. "Mr. Monroe, your generosity is immeasurable, but the patient's rights are sovereign. She is lucid and has made it clear she does not want you here. If we force it, the emotional stress could seriously compromise her recovery. I'm sorry." The irony was cruel. He was paying a fortune to save her, yet his very involvement was deemed a threat to her health. He was relegated to the status of a bank statement, an anonymous source of funds, while the real work of healing, physical and emotional, happened far from his sight. Frustration consumed him. He spent his nights awake, his mind circling a problem that couldn't be solved with logic or capital. He received daily updates from the doctors, cold, clinical reports on cell counts and treatment response. She was improving slowly. Every small medical victory was a stab to his heart because he couldn't share it, couldn't see the relief on her face, couldn't offer a word of comfort. It was in this vacuum of powerlessness that a new problem arose from a completely unexpected direction. The media, a gossip columnist, known for his nose for scandalous stories involving the city's elite, published a cryptic item. Which tech billionaire, known for his heart of ice, is secretly footing the $1 million medical bill for a mystery lady in distress at Mount Sinai? Sources say the connection is older and deeper than his PR team would like to admit. The item was vague, but for anyone in Arthur's social circle, the pieces fit. The leak had likely come from a hospital staffer, tempted by a quick payout. Within hours, the story exploded. Arthur Monroe's mystery philanthropy became the talk of the town. His name, which he had fought so hard to keep out of the equation, was now indelibly linked to Elena. His company's phones rang off the hook. Reporters camped outside his office and the hospital. Speculation ran wild. Was she a secret lover? An illegitimate child? A former employee with whom he'd had an affair? The narrative painted a sensationalist picture that threatened not only his privacy, but his business reputation, which was built on an image of impeccable control and rationality. His partners, men who, like him, valued profit above all else, were furious. In an emergency board meeting they called, the tension was palpable. "Arthur, what the hell is going on?" demanded Richard, the senior board member. "Your personal life is becoming a circus, and it's dragging the company's name through the mud." The stock dropped 2% this morning because of these rumors. Our investors are getting nervous." Arthur tried to defend himself, talking about privacy, a personal matter. But they didn't want excuses, they wanted damage control. "This isn't personal anymore, Arthur. It's a cash flow problem. This distraction is costing the company money. You need to fix this. And fast." He left the meeting feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. On one side, Elena, who repelled him. On the other, the empire he had built, now threatened by his attempt at redemption. And in the middle of it all, little Lucy, an innocent child he was trying to shield from the hurricane he had created. The situation was spiraling out of control. He was trying to right a past wrong. But every step he took seemed to create an even bigger disaster in the present. And worst of all, at the hospital, oblivious to the scandal swirling around her, Elena had begun to regress. The stress of seeing Arthur's name in the news, linked to her so publicly, was taking its toll. Arthur's world was disintegrating, piece by piece. The pressure was coming from all sides, a relentless siege that threatened to suffocate him. His partners treated him with a cold suspicion. The media painted him as a character in a soap opera. And Elena, the reason for all the turmoil, refused to speak to him, communicating only through nurses and lawyers he himself was paying for. He felt like a man trying to put out a forest fire with $100 bills. The only light in the chaos was little Lucy. He visited her at the temporary apartment, always under the guise of being a family friend sent to help. The girl's innocence was a balm to his tormented soul. They played with building blocks, read stories about dragons and princesses, and for a few moments Arthur could forget the weight of his net worth and the complexity of his mistakes. It was during one of these visits that the ground gave way beneath him. Lucy was drawing at a low table, concentrating, her tongue sticking out. Arthur watched her, a melancholic smile on his lips. "What are you drawing, little star?" he asked. Lucy held up the paper with pride. It was a drawing of 3 stick figures, a woman with long hair, a tall man, and herself in the middle, all holding hands under a smiling sun. "It's Mommy, you and me," she said with the devastating simplicity of children. Arthur's heart constricted. "Lucy, we've talked about this. I'm just a friend." She cut him off, her gaze serious and reproachful. "I know, but Mommy needs you. She used to be so sad. She had some old letters kept in a shoebox. Sometimes she'd read them and cry, they were yours." Arthur felt the air leave his lungs. Letters. He had never received any letters from her after the silence fell between them. He had assumed she'd given up, moved on. "What letters, Lucy? Are you sure?" The girl nodded vigorously. "Yes, they were for you. She wrote a bunch, a long, long time ago. She told me once it was when she found out she was sick. She wanted to tell you, but the mailman always brought them back. Said the address didn't exist anymore." The floor opened up. An abyss of terrible possibilities revealed itself. The time Lucy mentioned coincided exactly with his company's international expansion. He had moved to a new address, a high-security corporate campus, and the old office, where Elena had likely sent the letters, had been demolished. Her messages, her pleas for help, her silent screams had never reached him. They had returned to her, stamped with the cold indifference of the postal service, address unknown, just as he, to her, had become unknown. The revelation hit him with the force of a freight train. It wasn't just abandonment, it was negligence. He, so obsessed with building his business, with growing his fortune, hadn't even bothered to keep a line of communication open, a bridge to his past. He had burned the bridge and blamed Elena for the silence. The guilt he'd felt before was a pale shadow compared to the monster that now devoured him. She hadn't just suffered in silence. She had tried to reach him. She had reached out when she discovered her illness, when she needed support the most. And he, in his ivory tower, had been unreachable. He stood up, his mind spinning. He had to find those letters. They were the proof, the key to understanding the depth of his failure. "Lucy, where did your mom keep this box?" he asked, his voice tense. "In the back of the closet, behind the winter coats," she replied, oblivious to the storm she had just unleashed. He didn't wait. Leaving Lucy with the nanny and a mumbled excuse, he drove to Elena's old apartment, for which he had discreetly obtained a key. The place was simple, humble, but impeccably tidy. Every object seemed to tell a story of struggle and resilience. He went straight to the bedroom. He opened the closet and, with a hammering heart, found the shoebox exactly where Lucy had said. His hands trembled as he lifted the lid. Inside was a stack of envelopes, yellowed with age, all addressed to him, in her elegant, familiar handwriting. And on each one, the cruel red stamp, "Return to sender." He took the first letter, opened the envelope with reverent care, and began to read. And with every word, the truth of the last 10 years unfolded. A narrative of pain, fear, and loneliness that he, in his arrogance, never knew existed. The letters trembled in his hands. The paper was thin and fragile, almost crumbling to the touch. But the words written in Eleanor's script were indelible, burned into his conscience. Sitting on the floor of her small apartment, surrounded by the faint scent of lavender and the quiet of a life lived without him, Arthur read the chronicle of his own failure. The first letter was hesitant, full of cautious hope. She wrote about the diagnosis with a palpable fear, but also with the belief that if he knew, he would be there. "I know it's been a long time, Art," she wrote, "but I didn't know who else to turn to. I remembered our promises." The following letters grew more urgent. The disease was progressing, the doctors were puzzled, the bills were starting to pile up. She described selling a small gold ring her grandmother had given her, the tightening budget, the difficulty of continuing to work. And in each one, the painful confusion. "My letter came back again. Did you move? Why didn't you tell me?" The last letter was different. There were no more pleas for help, just a sad, profound resignation. It was a farewell. "I get it now, Art. You've built a new world for yourself, one where I don't fit. I hope your fortune brings you the happiness you were looking for. I'll be okay. I have to be okay for a new light that has come into my life." The mention of Lucy, written before she was even born, was the final blow. He hadn't just abandoned her to her fate with a terrible disease. He had forced her to find the strength to carry a new life alone. Believing the man she loved was deliberately ignoring her. His entire empire, his billion-dollar assets, his investments in stocks and treasury bonds, it all felt like toxic waste in that moment. They were monuments to his ignorance, his selfishness. The liabilities on his corporate balance sheets were nothing compared to the unpayable debt he owed her. He folded the letters with surgical care and placed them back in the box, as if they were sacred relics. The air in the apartment felt heavy, thick with years of unsaid suffering. He stood up, his legs weak. The image of the media scandal, of his furious partners, evaporated. None of it mattered. The only thing that mattered was the truth in that shoebox. The narrative the world was building about him, the mysterious philanthropist, the billionaire with a secret heart, was a merciful lie. The truth was much uglier. He was a coward who, through negligence, had silenced the distress calls of the woman he loved. Elena's ban on seeing him now made terrible sense. She didn't just hate him for leaving, she hated him for ignoring her in her moment of greatest desperation, or at least that's what she believed. A new urgency seized him, a desperate need to set the record straight, not for the world, but for her. He could no longer hide behind anonymous donations and intermediaries. He needed to look her in the eye and tell her the truth. He needed her to know he wasn't a monster who had received her pleas and thrown them away. He was just a fool blinded by ambition, but not a monster. It was a crucial distinction, perhaps the only thing that could salvage a fragment of his soul. He took the shoebox. It was his evidence, the only defense he had. With a determination he hadn't felt in years, he left the apartment and sped toward Mount Sinai Hospital. The rules, the prohibitions, her wrath, none of it mattered anymore. He would break through every barrier to get to her. He would bribe, beg, force his way in if he had to. Arriving at the hospital, he bypassed the front desk and used his knowledge of the service entrances to get to her floor. He stopped in front of her room door, heart pounding against his ribs, the shoebox clutched to his chest like a shield. He took a deep breath, raised his hand, and, ignoring all warnings, pushed the door open and walked in. The room was bathed in the soft twilight, the glow from the monitors casting an eerie light on the walls. Elena was sitting up in bed, propped against pillows, reading a book. The improvement in her appearance was remarkable. The sickly pallor had given way to a healthier tone, and her eyes, though still tired, held a spark of their old vitality. She looked up as the door opened, and upon seeing him, her face became a mask of ice. The book fell from her hands onto the blanket. "And what are you doing here?" she hissed, her voice low but sharp as broken glass. "I said I didn't want to see you. Call security." Arthur didn't move. He closed the door behind him, the soft click sounding like a final judgment. He took a step forward, holding out the shoebox like an offering. "Elena, please, you have to listen to me. Just 5 minutes." "Listen to what?" she retorted, bitterness dripping from every syllable. "More lies, more empty excuses. Do you have any idea what your sudden appearance has done? My name is all over the papers. I'm the mystery mistress of the great Arthur Monroe. People look at me with pity, with contempt. You've turned my fight for life into a circus sideshow." The pain in her voice was palpable, and every word was a dagger in Arthur's heart. He deserved it, and more. "I know. I'm so sorry for that. I never wanted any of this to happen," he said, his voice hoarse. "But that's not why I'm here. I'm here because of this." He approached the bed and carefully placed the shoebox at her feet. Elena stared at the box, her brow furrowed in confusion. She recognized it instantly. A shockwave passed over her face. Where did you get that?" "Lucy told me about them," he explained, his voice thick with emotion. "Elena, I swear on everything holy, I never received a single one of these letters. I never knew you tried to contact me. I never knew you were sick." He watched her face, searching for any sign that she believed him. But what he saw was a profound skepticism, a wall of mistrust built over a decade of pain. "How convenient, Arthur," she said, a humorless smile twisting her lips. "A perfect excuse, found at just the right time. You were always good with narratives, with crafting an image that suits you." The accusation wounded him more than any insult. He opened the box, took out the stack of envelopes, and held them out to her. "Look at the stamps, Eleanor. Return to sender. Address unknown." I was expanding the company. I moved offices, countries. I was an idiot, a work-obsessed fool who cut all ties with his past. I was negligent, but I didn't ignore you. I didn't know. Elena took the envelopes, her hands shaking. Her fingers traced her own handwriting, the postmarks, the red stamps that confirmed his story. She riffled through the letters, the pages of her own history of despair. A sob escaped her lips, a broken, fragile sound. The wall began to crack. The tears she had held back for so long began to stream down her face. They weren't tears of anger, but of a deep, ancient pain. The pain of having felt invisible, ignored, discarded. Arthur felt an overwhelming urge to hold her, to comfort her, but he stopped himself. He had no right. He stood there, motionless, accepting the weight of her grief as his penance. "I believed," she whispered through her sobs. "I believed you had read every word and chosen to do nothing, that your silence was an answer." "I know," he said, his own voice breaking. "And nothing I say can erase the pain that belief caused you. Nothing can give you back the years you suffered alone. But I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." He looked at her, his heart laid bare. All his wealth and power reduced to nothing before this fragile woman in a hospital bed. The truth was between them, finally. But the truth wasn't a cure. It was just the first step on a long, uncertain road. The door opened suddenly, and a nurse came in, stopping short at the scene. "Mr. Monroe, you can't be in here." Elena raised a hand, silencing her. She wiped her tears with the back of her hand and looked at Arthur, her eyes red and swollen, but holding a new clarity. "Stay," she said, her voice still weak but firm. "We need to talk." The nurse hesitated for a moment, glancing from Elena's determined expression to Arthur's tormented face, then quietly backed out, closing the door with a care that sealed the room in a bubble of tension and unspoken truth. The silence that followed was heavier than any words. It was filled with 10 years of misunderstanding, of lonely pain and empty success. Elena was the first to break it, her voice devoid of its earlier rage, now tinged with a deep weariness, the exhaustion of someone who had fought on too many fronts for too long. "Sit down, Arthur," she said, gesturing to the uncomfortable armchair by the bed. It wasn't an invitation, it was a command. He obeyed, feeling like a defendant before his judge. He wanted to speak, to explain more, but he knew it was her turn. He owed her his silence, at the very least. "You don't know what it was like," she began, her eyes fixed on a distant point on the wall, as if projecting a film of her past there. "You have no idea what it's like to get a diagnosis that sounds like a death sentence, and the first person you think of is the one who promised you the world, only to find out their world doesn't even have a mailing address anymore." She paused, taking a deep breath. "I didn't want your money, your fortune. I wanted support. I wanted the hand that held mine in college, but it wasn't there. So I did what I always do. I carried on. I got a second job, cleaning offices at night after I finished teaching school. I was always tired, Arthur, a bone-deep kind of tired. Every word was a blow. He could picture her, exhausted, struggling to keep her head above water while he, at the same time, was celebrating his company's IPO on the stock exchange, toasting with expensive champagne. "When I found out I was pregnant with Lucy, it was terrifying and wonderful all at once," she continued, a soft light entering her eyes at the mention of her daughter's name. "She gave me a reason to fight harder. But it also meant more bills, more fear. Her father, he couldn't handle it. And I don't blame him. It was too much pressure." Arthur clenched his fists, his anger at the other man mixing with his own shame. "While you were probably worrying about the yield on your bonds or the price of Bitcoin, I was worrying if I'd have enough for rent and medication in the same month. Your wealth, the kind the papers celebrate, was a parallel universe to me. A universe you kicked me out of." "I didn't kick you out, Elena. I got lost," he tried, but she held up a hand, cutting him off. It doesn't matter what the verb was anymore. The result was the same. I was alone. Their conversation was interrupted by a soft knock. It was the same nurse. "Sorry to interrupt," she said gently, "but Ms. Elena's blood pressure is a little high. I think that's enough excitement for one day." Arthur stood immediately, guilt washing over him again. He was hurting her. "You're right. I'll go." He turned to Eleanor, his gaze pleading. Can we talk again tomorrow?" Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, then gave a barely perceptible nod. It was the most he could hope for. As he left the room, the nurse walked with him down the hall. "Mr. Monroe, your little Lucy was here earlier," she commented in a low voice. "She's a lovely girl, full of imagination." Arthur smiled. "Yes, she is." The nurse hesitated, her expression growing more serious. "She's been going around the corridors, talking to other patients. She tells them her mom is all better and that you're going to take them to live in a castle. Some of the families have gotten a bit confused, even upset, by the false hope she's creating." Arthur stopped walking, the blood freezing in his veins. Lucy, in her childish attempt to create a happy ending, was making up stories, spinning a narrative that didn't exist. He had come to the hospital to solve one problem and discovered that while he was trying to fix the past with Elena, a delicate new problem, born from a child's innocence, was blooming right under his nose. The revelation about Lucy's stories added a new layer of complexity to the emotional labyrinth Arthur found himself in. He spent a sleepless night, not just replaying the painful conversation with Eleanor, but also pondering how to address the fantasy Lucy was building. The girl, in her purity, was trying to fix the broken adult world the only way she knew how, with imagination. She was crafting a narrative of hope, but the foundations of that story were fragile and could cause more pain than comfort. The next day, he went to see Lucy before going to the hospital. He found her on the living room floor, building an immense tower of colorful blocks. "Look," she said excitedly, "it's our castle, with a really big room for Mommy to rest in." Arthur's heart ached. He sat down beside her, his voice gentle. "Lucy, we need to talk about the stories you've been telling at the hospital." The girl stopped playing, her smile vanishing. "The stories about the castle?" "Yes, and about Mommy being all better," he said, choosing his words carefully. "I know you want everything to be okay, and I do too, more than anything. But Mommy is still sick. She's getting better. But it's a slow process. And when we tell stories that aren't true, it can confuse people and make them sad." Lucy looked down at her blocks, her lip trembling. "But I just wanted to help," she whispered. "I wanted Mommy to hear and believe she was going to get better soon." Arthur pulled her into a hug, feeling the frailness of her small shoulders. "I know, my little star, and you do help so much, just by being here and loving your mom so much. Your love is the best medicine for her." The conversation was difficult but necessary. He understood that Lucy's lies weren't malicious. They were a coping mechanism, a spell to ward off the harsh reality. Later, at the hospital, he found Elena more receptive. The truth, however painful, seemed to have opened a small crack in the wall between them. They talked for hours, not about the past, but about the present, about Lucy, he told her gently. About the stories the girl was creating. Elena sighed, a sad sound. "She's always been like that. She lives in a world of fairy tales. I think it was her way of coping with my illness, with our hard life." For the first time, they were united by a common concern, like parents. They discussed how they could, together, help Lucy understand the situation without destroying her hope. This conversation built a new bridge between them, fragile but real. However, as one bridge was being built, another was burning. The media scandal, far from dying down, had intensified. Photos of Arthur entering and leaving the hospital were splashed across magazine covers, and his partners, who saw the world through the cold lens of profit and loss, decided the distraction had become too great a liability. Richard, the board's spokesman, summoned him to his office. The atmosphere was glacial. "Arthur, we admire your loyalty to this woman," he began, the word loyalty laced with contempt. "But the company is suffering. Our Asian investors are threatening to pull a multi-billion-dollar investment fund because of the CEO's emotional instability. The board has voted. We want you to step down." Arthur was stunned. "Step down? This is my company. I built it from nothing." "And we helped it grow," Richard retorted, impassive. "And we will not watch it sink because of your personal problems. You have two options. Either you sell your majority stake to the board at a fair price, or we will call a shareholder meeting to have you forcibly removed, citing conduct detrimental to the business. Either way, you're out." It was a corporate coup, cold and brutal. The men he trusted, with whom he'd built an empire, were using his vulnerability to pry him from his own throne. They were using his love for Elena as a weapon against him. He was cornered. If he fought, the battle would be public and bloody, dragging Elena's name further into the mud. If he gave in, he would lose his life's work. As he was processing the ultimatum, his cell phone rang. It was Dr. Evans from the hospital. The doctor's voice was grave. "Mr. Monroe, I need you to come here immediately. Mrs. Elena has had a sudden, severe complication. We had to place her in a medically induced coma." Arthur's world collapsed. Everything was happening at once. The threat of losing his company, Elena's drastic turn for the worse, the social services investigation into his relationship with Lucy that he'd just learned had begun. He was losing everything. The chance to reconcile, the company that was his identity, and now, perhaps, Elena herself. He looked at Richard, his face pale, and in his eyes, he saw not just the loss of his empire, but the abyss of a future without the woman he finally realized he couldn't live without. The hospital corridor became the epicenter of Arthur's collapse. The white walls seemed to close in, and the steady, rhythmic beeping from Elena's room was a form of torture, each sound a reminder that her life was hanging by a thread. Medically induced coma. The doctor's words echoed in his mind, clinical and cold, belying the catastrophe they represented, all the conversations, all the truths revealed, the fragile bridge they had started to build across the chasm of a decade. It all felt for nothing. He was outside the room, looking through the glass, just as he had been on the first day, but it was different now. Before, he was a ghost observing his past. Now, he was a man watching his future being erased before his eyes. Little Lucy sat in a chair beside him, huddled and small, clutching a stuffed rabbit with desperate force. The nanny had brought her at his request. He couldn't bear the thought of her being alone, but he also didn't know how to explain the gravity of the situation. To her, her mother was just taking a very, very deep sleep. But a child's intuition is powerful, and Lucy could feel the thick despair in the air. She didn't ask questions. She just stared at the door to the room, her face pale and serious, waiting for her mother to wake up. To see the girl's silent pain was like having salt rubbed in his own open wounds. He had failed Elena in the past, and he felt he was failing Lucy in the present. His phone vibrated incessantly in his pocket. His lawyers, his partners, the media, the business world didn't stop for personal drama. Richard's ultimatum hung over his head like a guillotine. Sell your company or be publicly humiliated. Lose your empire quietly, or fight and drag Elena's name into an even bigger scandal. He looked at Elena's serene, motionless face through the glass. The machines breathed for her, lived for her. The experimental treatment, her only hope, was crushingly expensive. The daily cost of the ICU was exorbitant. Without the cash flow from his company, how long could he sustain this? The fortune he had amassed was vast, but not infinite, especially in the face of a medical battle with no end in sight. It was then that the fourth battlefront opened. A severe-looking woman in a grey business suit approached them in the corridor. "Mr. Monroe, I'm Ms. Albright from Social Services. We've received anonymous complaints regarding your relationship with the minor, Lucy, and her mother's situation. I need to ask you a few questions." The anonymous complaints had surely come from his partners, a cruel, low blow to increase the pressure. The woman began her interrogation right there in the hallway, her voice quiet but probing. Who was he? What was his relationship to the family? Why was he providing housing and support for a child who was not his relative? Each question was a veiled insinuation, painting him as a suspicious and unsuitable figure. Lucy heard everything, her eyes wide with fear, clinging to Arthur's leg. He tried to answer calmly, explaining his long friendship with Elena. But his words sounded weak against the cold bureaucracy. Miss Albright jotted everything down on her notepad, her face impassive. "We will have to conduct a full investigation. Until then, it may be best for the child to be placed in temporary foster care." The threat of losing Lucy was the last straw, losing Eleanor to illness, losing his company to betrayal. And now, losing the girl to the system. Despair gave way to an icy rage and absolute clarity. He looked at the woman, then at Lucy, and finally at the door to Elena's room. In that instant, everything he had built, his entire net worth, every stock and asset, lost all meaning. They were just tools, and he was about to use the biggest one of all. He took out his phone, ignoring the dozens of missed calls from his lawyers, and dialed his personal banker. "Robert, it's Arthur. I need you to do something for me. Immediately. I want you to prepare the paperwork to mortgage everything. Every property, every stock, every bond. I want to liquidate all of my assets, my entire net worth. I want it all transferred into a single trust fund, the fund for Elena's treatment." On the other end of the line, there was a stunned silence. But Arthur was calm. He was about to make the biggest investment of his life. Not for profit, not for image, but for love. He was betting everything, his entire fortune, on the woman lying in a coma just a few feet away. The act of mortgaging his entire life was surprisingly liberating. As lawyers and bankers moved in a frenzy to liquidate his vast estate, an unprecedented calm settled over Arthur. He was dismantling the empire that had both defined and imprisoned him for a decade. Every signature on a transfer document was a brick removed from the wall around his heart. The news of his decision spread like wildfire through the financial world. His partners were stunned. The move was so radical, so irrational from a business perspective, that they didn't know how to react. Their hostile takeover bid was withdrawn. There was no company left to take, only a man voluntarily liquidating his kingdom for a personal cause. The media, once focused on scandal, now reported the story with a tone of reluctant awe. The billionaire sacrificing it all for love was a far more powerful narrative. With massive capital now secured in an impenetrable trust fund, dedicated solely to the care of Elena and Lucy, Arthur was able to silence the concerns of social services. Ms. Albright, upon seeing irrefutable proof of his financial commitment to the family's well-being, closed her investigation. Lucy would stay with him. It was the first victory amid the chaos, and it gave him the strength to go on. The days turned into weeks. Arthur never left Elena's side. He set up a makeshift office in the hospital waiting room, managing the dismantling of his old life while holding vigil. He read to her, even in her deep sleep, telling her stories of their college days, reminding her of the promises and dreams they had shared. He talked to Lucy, patiently explaining that her mom needed a lot of rest to get better. The girl, seeing Arthur's unwavering devotion, found a new sense of security and stopped her fantasy stories, replacing them with drawings that she taped to the window of her mother's room. The experimental treatment, now funded without limit, began to work. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Elena's vital signs stabilized. The inflammation markers went down. The doctors, once cautious, began to use the word miracle. And then, on a rainy morning, 6 weeks after Lucy had walked into his office with a pink piggy bank, it happened. Arthur was sitting by Elena's bed, holding her hand, when he felt a faint squeeze of her fingers. He snapped his head up. Her eyes were opening, not groggily or confused, but with a clarity that pierced him. She looked at him, then at her hand intertwined with his. She saw Lucy's drawings on the window, Arthur's tired but present face. "You're," she whispered, her voice weak. "You're still here. I'm never leaving again," he replied, the tears he'd held back for weeks finally streaming down his face. Elena's recovery was gradual but steady. As she regained her strength, she also learned the extent of Arthur's sacrifice. She heard from the doctors about the unlimited fund. She saw the news reports about the end of his empire. She realized the man by her side, helping her with physical therapy and reading to her at night, was no longer the untouchable billionaire, but a man who had traded his fortune for a second chance with her. One afternoon, as the spring sun streamed through the window, She turned to him. "You lost everything, Arthur." "For me," he smiled. A genuine, light smile she hadn't seen since they were young. "I didn't lose anything, Elena. I was lost, and I found my way back home. It took me 10 years, but I finally understand what a real asset is. And it has nothing to do with stocks or dividends." In that moment, the last barrier between them dissolved, not out of gratitude, but out of a rediscovered love, purified by the fire of sacrifice and loss. She reached out and touched his face. "Welcome back, Art." The second victory was the sweetest, winning back her trust, her love, not through grand gestures of wealth, but through the constancy of his presence, the sincerity of his regret. They rebuilt their relationship day by day, in quiet conversations, in shared smiles, in the simple comfort of being together. The final victory came a few months later when Eleanor was discharged. Arthur took her and Lucy, not to one of his former mansions, which no longer belonged to him, but to a comfortable, welcoming house in the suburbs, a place meant to be a home, not a showpiece. The family Lucy had tried to buy with her piggy bank was finally together, bound not by a business contract, but by ties of love, forgiveness, and true sacrifice. A year later, the air in Arthur Monroe's house no longer smelled of imported coffee and the sterile scent of money, but of orange cake baking in the oven and freshly cut grass from the yard. The sound that filled the rooms wasn't the quiet hum of servers processing stock market data, but the infectious laughter of Lucy as she chased a newly adopted mutt around the backyard. Elena, her hair in a messy bun and a healthy glow in her eyes, watched from the porch, her hand resting on Arthur's shoulder. He no longer wore expensive suits, but a simple cotton shirt, and his face was not a mask of ruthless control, but etched with the soft lines of deep contentment. He had traded a panoramic view of the city for a clear view of everything that truly mattered. The old fortune, the assets and holdings, had become a distant memory, a story he would one day tell to teach the difference between price and value. In that backyard, under an arch of jasmine Elena had planted, they were married. The ceremony was simple, with just a few close friends and the neighbor who had looked after Lucy. There were no society photographers or newspaper columns. The little girl, in a white dress with a pink sash, was the flower girl and ring bearer. She walked solemnly across the lawn, not with a satin pillow, but carrying the old piggy bank, now empty and polished, with 2 simple gold bands nestled inside. When she handed it to Arthur, her eyes sparkled. "The business proposal is accepted," she whispered, and everyone laughed. In that moment, the most important transaction of Arthur's life was complete. It involved no capital or interest, but a promise sealed with a kiss that tasted of second chances. They were not idle. The energy Arthur once poured into expanding his multi-billion-dollar business was now channeled into a new venture. Together, he and Elena started the Helena Lucy Foundation. The seed money came from what was left of his old fortune, but their true investment was their time and experience. In a small office set up in a spare room of their house, they worked side by side. Elena, with her empathy and first-hand knowledge of hardship, coordinated direct support for families. Arthur, with his business acumen, managed the funds and sought partnerships to ensure the project's sustainability. They weren't seeking profit, but human return. The foundation offered not just financial aid for rare disease treatments, but also psychological and logistical support, everything Elena had lacked in her years of lonely struggle. Her past suffering was transformed into a purpose for the future. That evening, as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Arthur looked at his new life. He watched Elena helping Lucy water the flowers, their laughter drifting on the air. He no longer had an empire of concrete and glass, but he was, for the first time, a truly wealthy man. The billionaire who had everything and owned nothing had learned the most valuable lesson from the unlikeliest of deal-makers. He discovered that the best investment a man can make isn't in stocks or crypto, but in the heart of the one he loves. The little girl who saved every penny to buy a father for her mother had taught the business world that the most valuable proposals don't come in contracts, but in pink piggy banks, filled with a currency that no stock exchange can quote, hope.